Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. Software engineering and research doesn't only happen in physics or biology, but also in the wide area of sciences called humanities. Meet James Baker, my guest for this episode, who just recently started his new role as Director of Digital Humanities at the University of Southampton in the UK. Digital humanities is a broad church, and an important aspect of this role is to build bridges between the different disciplines. James' new position is an exciting opportunity to help and facilitate this, and in my conversation with him we touch on different ways on how this can be accomplished. And here now my conversation with James Baker. Hello James, welcome to the show and thanks for your time today. Maybe we can start with some introductions.
I'm James Baker. I'm the Director of Digital Humanities at the University of Southampton.
That sounds like an exciting role. I think it's a new role, isn't it? I mean, you just started the job, didn't you?
Yeah, I've just started in September, come over from the University of Sussex. I'm in the School of Humanities here at Southampton. I guess I've arrived at a kind of complicated time in the history of higher education, but it's been really exciting and my colleagues have been incredibly welcoming. It's part really of a kind of a general kind of investment in digital humanities at Southampton that includes some new space, me as a new person, and a kind of a commitment, I guess, to embed some of the approaches from digital humanities into undergraduate education, but also into the ways in which we do research and the ways in which we do knowledge exchange and all that kind of stuff.
Could you explain how we actually got there? I mean, Director of a digital humanities department sounds very exciting. Where did it all start?
It started for me with a research question. I was trying to figure out how to understand the distribution of businesses that, I guess, supported the trade in satirical prints in the late 18th century. So I was interested in the people who made the paper, the people who made the oil, the people who made the copper plates, all that kind of stuff, because my background is very much in the history of the printed image. And I thought, I'll make a map of London because most of those trades were in London that I was looking at. And so I was putting my printmakers on the map and I was putting my colour men on the map. And then I started thinking, well, this is a bit stupid because my map is a physical printout with some blobs of colour on it. And I want to turn off the stationers, for example, because there were too many of them and they were interrupting with my kind of interpretation of the spatial distribution. So I thought, I'm probably going to have to try and work out how to do that digitally. And that was not something I knew how to do. I knew where the source materials were, which were the list of post office directories, which University of London have a load of at the Institute of Historical Research. I knew that it was possible to make a map and put things on it. And I just gradually figured it out, how to kind of extract data from one, how to georeference it on the other, how to understand and kind of work with the fact that the historical distribution of London in the late 18th century is different than the kind of the geographical distribution of London today. Streets have changed, things like that, and just sort of gradually figured it out. And kind of from there, sort of ended up picking up a series of skills that meant that I could manipulate data and present data that was not about putting a map in a paper, but was about helping me think through research questions that I had. Alongside that, I because this was very shortly after my kind of doctoral research, alongside that, I also got a job in my university library, University of Kent, working on their open access repository. And specifically, I was tasked with cleaning up the way in which authors, for example, misrepresent their own names. Misrepresent's probably the wrong word, but they kind of put their own names into the database of their scholarly publications in multiple ways and trying to reconcile that data and make it kind of clean. So I kind of taught myself how to do a bit of data cleaning. And also because I was doing that role at the time around the Finch report in 2012 when open access was kicking off, I also sort of started to get involved in open access communities, which kind of dovetailed with thinking around open data and open science and stuff like that. So I kind of came at this sort of digital thing in the humanities from sort of a multiple set of perspectives, and ended up sort of falling from a very sort of traditional humanities education, falling towards thinking about what it means to do research in the 21st century in the digital age, and the ways in which we might computationally start approaching some of the questions that we have as humanities scholars.
I think digital humanities is a rather broad brush, and you touched on one aspect of it. I mean, the doctoral research that you did that led you to computing. What does the term actually mean to you? What is digital humanities, and what does it actually entail?
I mean, to me, it kind of means two things. It means it's an umbrella. It's a kind of a soft field to me of people on one hand who are trying to help us navigate the contemporary world. It could include people who are working in media studies, for example, or critical data studies. They may not see themselves as digital humanities scholars, but some of them may sort of drift into those spaces and interact with people who are more kind of closely identify with it as a field. And then the second groups of people who are, I think, as I said, sort of before with my own sort of where I started, are starting to try and ask questions to do with literature, for example, or questions to do with music, or questions to do with history, where they are finding data sources, using data sources, making data sources, and trying to use that as part of their scholarly argument. That's not something, for example, in the discipline of history, which is where I come from, that's not something that's kind of totally alien to us. I mean, quantitative historians were a thing in the early to mid 20th century. That became less fashionable for various reasons in the late 20th century, but economic history has kind of retained a kind of strand within historical thought. And so there is a way in which even in folks who work in economic history and quantitative economic history are aligned in the modern age with digital humanities. I also think it's worth noting, though, that I think it is very personal because it's very place-based. If I go across to the Benelux region, for example, there's a wonderful Digital Humanities Benelux conference, which I'm very fond of. I'm often struck by the fact that the historians there, because they have more of a tradition of quantitative social history, for example, are more comfortable working in the digital humanities. Whilst if we pop across to North America, there's a often much closer alignment of digital humanities with literary studies. Not in all cases, but there was a perennial digital humanities flame wars going on at the moment on Twitter, where there's some scholar, I can't remember the guy's name, in literary studies in North America, basically writing a paper trying to defend literature against digital humanities under the assumption that literary studies and digital humanities are incredibly closely aligned. And for me, I see that as a very North American way of thinking. And then I guess there's that kind of bit around the edge that's the kind of the cultural heritage sector. Colleagues I work with a lot in that sector, people working on things like digital preservation, people working on things like crowdsourcing and stuff like that, which again sort of like drift over into digital humanities thinking. For me, it becomes an umbrella. And I guess what I'm trying to get across to colleagues at Southampton, particularly early career colleagues, I don't feel they have to align with digital humanities. I don't think they have to say they come from there. I want them to see themselves as literary scholars or music scholars. But I feel that digital humanities in an institutional context can provide a space where people can kind of share and people can kind of like test out ideas where within their own disciplinary areas, they might find that people aren't working quite in the same way, thinking around computational research or thinking around navigation of the digital age. It's a useful kind of community umbrella from my perspective, really.
So there's an argument to be had that nowadays research can hardly ever happen without at least some kind of computational effort in it. At the same time, you mentioned there are quite different strands of digital humanities. It depends on the culture, it depends on the country, it depends on the fields and the subfields. So how do you bring this all together in this role that you now have?
I think for me, it's about trying to set to one side a notion that there is a set of digital humanities approaches that people might be able to learn and therefore apply. And instead trying to work with people to say, well, what do we want to collectively achieve? What do we think actually is important? And trying to ground that in people's own disciplinary backgrounds at the same time. I've often joked that, my job for many years has been to get rid of myself. I was a digital curator at the British Library for a number of years. And ultimately, the ideal would be that you didn't need people who are digital curators. I'm not trying to put my former colleagues out of work at this point. I think they do incredible work, but I'm sure they kind of agree that you'd want the kind of curatorial kind of space to just feel comfortable with digital technologies, whether it be collecting born digital materials, apps, for example, as literature, or whether it be creating large collections of newspaper data to be used by humanities scholars or scholars in other fields. And I don't necessarily think that my current job is to get rid of myself in the short term, but I do feel that what I want to do is simply act as a pivot and a hub that enables people to bounce back between their disciplinary areas and a kind of this wider sort of umbrella field. I'm not sure I'm trying to bring things together so much as give people a space to kind of share and seek advice. If there is a thread, I think, that runs through my approach to digital humanities, I think it is that I'm trying to think as a historian on one hand, but also think about how some of the resonances of the past impact the present and we can mitigate effects in the future. So, for example, I do quite a lot of work on catalogue data. So things written about art objects or things written about museum objects, for example. And some of that catalogue data was written in the late 19th century or the early 20th century. For various reasons, as objects become digitized and made available online, it's often those same descriptions or lightly adapted version of those older descriptions that make their way through to the present. And so I've done some very specific research on one particular cataloger in a domain I know quite well, and trying to understand her kind of curatorial voice, the way in which she produced work and the social context in which she was working, and collaborating with a colleague who's a linguist to do that. Part of that's about pure historical research, thinking, what is it that makes a woman working in the 1940s write in a particular way? What are the kind of social pressures that mean that she produces certain types of catalogue descriptions? But it's also about the present, in the sense that they're still with us. And what does that mean for contemporary users who then access those materials, that they're navigating to those collections through her particular view of the world and way of seeing the world in the way she described? And it's also about the future, in the sense that those catalogue data are increasingly being used to feed machine learning systems to understand, say, the relationship between text and image, for example. Cultural collections and cultural institutions to have rich descriptions which can be used for these processes. And it's like, well, do we want someone writing in the 1940s with their particular worldview to be feeding into machine learning systems which are then producing language and ways of thinking that will maybe determine the way we understand the world in the future? And we probably want to know more about those individuals and know more about their worldviews. We're not feeding sort of machine learning and AI systems with bad actors, essentially, who are going to reproduce certain ways of thinking that we don't want in the future. For me, that if there's a thread, for me, it's that which is trying to encourage people to see those connections, and to see that the work that we do in the digital humanities can be often about very specific disciplinary areas and maybe working on material in the past, but then seeing those connections with wider kind of technology systems that we encounter in our everyday lives, and saying, what can we achieve that can help? I mean, I'm not naive. I don't think I'm going to influence the way Google work, but I think I can produce work that makes people think about the ways in which contemporary computational systems work and the ways in which they might sort of reduce harms in the future by acting slightly differently than they might have thought to.
So I think one question that comes to mind is that normally when we talk about software engineering in research, we talk about generalists, but here you're working in digital humanities. So how do you think that the role, and you outlined that already a little bit, but how do you think that your role will be different to what we traditionally see as a research software engineer? Do you see there's going to be any difference at all, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. So I wouldn't see myself as a software engineer, and I certainly think that most people I encounter and work with in the humanities who maybe have a digital hat on in some way probably don't see themselves as software engineers either. There are some, and I'm privileged to work with some on some projects like the Programming Historian, for example, where some of my colleagues have much more technical aptitude than I do. From my perspective, the way I work and the way I try and encourage people in sort of the disciplines that I encounter in the humanities to work is that we shouldn't kid ourselves into thinking we are going to become software engineers. That's not our job. That's not our profession. We can learn some tools and some ways of working. I teach on the carpentries. I try and communicate basic sort of research computing skills to people and stuff like that. And I hope people will see the value in developing bits of Shell or bits of R or bits of other bits and pieces. But ultimately, I think what's interesting with the digital humanities is the digital humanities is quite inherently collaborative. That's not to say the humanities more broadly isn't, but there is more of a culture, I guess, in the humanities of the single authored paper, the single authored work, the single authored outputs, if not necessarily projects. What I try to think that DH can do is be a collaborative space that does work more closely with the research software engineering community. I also think it's quite interesting that, I'm a huge fan of the research software engineering community, and I'm Software Sustainability Institute fellow, and I've seen that kind of community build and grow. And I can see, I learn a huge amount going to collaborations, workshops and things like that from people in research software engineer roles, because just spending time with those people, I think can be incredibly inspiring. What I find interesting in digital humanities is there are a lot of roles in digital humanities departments in various or groups or clusters or whatever in various parts of the world where people are kind of working as research software engineers. They're not quite, but they sort of are. I was really interested and intrigued that the Turing Institute ran I can't remember the name of it, but their workshop earlier this year that was on sort of research software engineering for humanities. And I know people who went to those workshops who are essentially researchers in the humanities who are sort of postdoctoral level and kind of trying to think of what to do next. And it's sort of like, do I continue with a kind of research career as a kind of a lead researcher, or do I feel actually I really enjoy working as say a colleague I work with, for example, someone who's a computational linguist. He's a hugely capable linguist, but he also just quite likes working with other people on their projects. And he's starting to think, well, do I drift towards being more of a kind of RSE role, but someone who is an RSE who works quite closely with people in the humanities as a kind of specialism? And I find that quite interesting because obviously, RSEs are a neutral space. But I'm sure lots of people who work in RSE groups would also recognize that there are clusters of the university they maybe work with more than others. And at least at Southampton, I'm aware that the humanities is not an area that traditionally has been working with the RSE group. I find that kind of that interaction very interesting because I'm a big fan of RSEs. I've numerous occasions at different employers tried to find a way of hiring someone with the title research software engineer, and we never quite get there. We always get to something similar, but not quite that. One of the things I'm hoping at Southampton certainly is not to try and replicate a research software engineer cluster within my group, but to work closely with the existing group here to kind of forge those connections a bit more and to demonstrate to kind of colleagues the value of working with people who approach software engineering tasks for research not as give me requirements, I'll produce thing, but instead as a kind of collaborative process where they bring a series of kind of ethical and process related kind of requirements to you as a researcher and say, actually, I'll work with you, but I also want you to do these things along the way, as well as me delivering on kind of your requirements.
So in addition to the collaborative space that you want to create at Southampton University for Digital Humanities, there's also maybe a little bit of catch up to do, something kind of like teaching, and you alluded to that earlier. We need to introduce people a little bit more to the technologies that might help them in their research. How would you go about that? Do you see that as part of your remit as well as providing a collaborative space?
Yeah, no, definitely. So my approach tends to be sort of a bit of ground up, a bit of top down. In my first few months here at Southampton, we've been running a series of kind of community workshops under sort of three main headings. One's are the start events, which are kind of start learning something, start analyzing data with R, for example. Make workshops, which have been about come along and make something together. So make a map that can tell a story, or make a machine that can write. And talk workshops where they're not really presentations, but they're like software demos or hardware demos or talks about things that are going on in the digital humanities. People said to me, it'd be really useful to know how to scrape the web. So I said, okay, well, I'll put a workshop on that because I know how to do that. And I can, at least it's a starting point, get people going so they can go off and learn some more. But equally, I think the workshop that was on Make a Machine That Can Write reflects that there are rapid advances in certain neural network technologies that I think people in the humanities would really benefit from knowing more about. It's not just about the doing, it's about trying to understand what's going on there within those technologies. So there's a bit of that going on. As a result of doing some of those things, people have come back and said, well, I want something else. I'm hoping to run a carpentries workshop, for example, at Southampton that is under the kind of the heading of Southampton Digital Humanities, because it seems there is an appetite and a kind of need for that as well. So on one hand, there's that bit. And I think one of the things I've been really keen to do at Southampton is not to make that just about professional development. All of those things are available to undergraduates, postgraduates, taught, research, and staff as well. So the idea is that people kind of show up to a space together and students and staff see that they're learning the same things at the same time and that they are all starting from the same kind of baseline with the stuff. But there's also more formal routes. And, I've worked in the past on undergraduate curricula and trying to integrate computational approaches and thinking into undergraduate curricula. And that's something that we're definitely hoping to do more of at Southampton. But that takes time. There's a bottom-up side to this as well, which is just about trying to generate kind of students who leave a university a way of thinking about their studies, which is looped into how the kind of the world is inflected by all these digital technologies. They leave their degree program thinking that they studied literature, but they also kind of understand the relationship between literature and digital technologies and potentially even computational approaches to the study of literature. And I think that's incredibly powerful, whether or not those people go into doing more education or whether those people go out into the wider world.
Well, you kind of answered the question that I was about to ask next, which is how do we get this into curricula, which is quite interesting. But let's talk a little bit more about collaborative spaces, because collaborative spaces implies that we actually break silos and that people from different departments start working together. And I think in large organizations, not just in universities, that usually is the hardest bit to do. So how do you think you can go about this and actually bring people together?
I mean, it's hard. One of the challenges of digital humanities as an interdisciplinary space is that it would be easier just to silo ourselves off and go, well, let's just treat it like a disciplinary area and let's just hire people who are called digital humanities people and let's keep ourselves away from everybody else because that's the easy route. I feel as though trying to help people see the communities of practice that exist is a way of doing that. If you can get people together and you can show them that between them there are things they want to achieve that are very similar in terms of, for example, things they would like to learn, that shows them that there is a community that exists that is not just they want to learn something within, say, their disciplinary area, say film, for example, but there's a colleague somewhere else, say in politics, who wants to learn something similar. And maybe that could be a space where those individuals could learn together in some way. I think another way of thinking about interdisciplinarity is kind of to just, I don't worry about it too much. I know that I have pressures around where I sit, but sometimes it's just about saying, well, we want to do good work and we want to achieve certain things. And if we can find spaces where people can share the work that they want to do and share the work, things that they have ambitions for, then hopefully people just stop worrying about what their discipline is a little bit and want to just get on with doing some good work. That's hard. And particularly when people's sort of disciplinary areas are further apart from each other kind of naturally and intellectually, that's quite hard, particularly if they have certain disciplines are very, very strong intellectual traditions. Yeah, I guess the thing is that I keep saying to people, I don't really care about digital humanities as a discipline. I care about good work. But if I can kind of encourage that, I feel as though I might be able to encourage people just to sort of do good work together as opposed to worry too much about what it means within their discipline.
When it comes down to it, a lot of people will be actually willing to work with other people from different disciplines. And that's at least my experience, that there's usually a willingness across the board. Where we hit the boundaries, however, are the structural impediments, right? Sort of like the funding and which budget does it go into, and the whole formalities that actually surround research, unfortunately, as well, not just the willingness of the people participating in it. That is quite a difficult boundary to cross because that means some structural changes as well.
I mean, I'm in a position at the moment where I'm not in a formal structure. So I've just joined Southampton. Digital humanities is not a department, it's not an institute, it's not a research group, it's not a school, it's not a faculty, whatever. It is just a thing that we've sort of invented with my arrival. And one of my jobs is to figure out how that entity will be structured. And that, brings with it its own challenges because, as you say, the easy thing to do would be to say, well, I need to fit within the formal structures of the university because that gives support and sustainability and simplicity of budget lines and all those kind of things. At the same time, we're exploring the idea of what it means to be an interdisciplinary department and what it means to not necessarily have a core of undergrads who therefore justify X number of staff being in the department, who then justify the ways in which, you feed into certain committees or stuff like that. The structures are there, but I think, at least in my case, I'm feeling there's a willingness to kind of to play with the structures a little bit. And there's an understanding that at a local level, maybe those structures aren't working with some of the collective ambitions that we have. In terms of a wider kind of sectoral level, I guess one of the hardest things for me, I find about working in interdisciplinary space is that bit at the end of writing a UKRI funding application. And I don't know why we always leave this to last, but we always do. When you sort of, you're done, and then there's that bit that says, what discipline are you submitting this to? You have to say which disciplinary areas you're in. That makes an enormous difference potentially as to whether or not your work will get funded. Because ultimately it defines who you're speaking to, it defines who your reviewers will be, it defines, which panel you're going to end up on, all that kind of stuff. I think the hardening thing, at least in the spaces which I work in, is the extent to which there have been a lot of interdisciplinary sort of funding calls that have been coming out, which align closely with digital humanities. Calls to do things like towards a national collection, which, although is very much focused on the cultural sector and the GLAM sector, is still very much, I think, interdisciplinary in the sense that the grants that have been funded through that are collaborations between cultural institutions and people in humanities departments and people outside of humanities departments, and means that the panels which are judging those are naturally judging through interdisciplinary lenses. There are kind of standard funding route problems which do funnel people into thinking in disciplinary terms. I mean, the other way around that, of course, is, a proposal's a proposal, but a project's a project. And these things are very different. If you're working truly tactically, you understand your audience, you write for an audience, but you deliver a
Yes.
project that is still in the spirit of what you proposed and is not breaking the convention, breaking with what your commitment is to your funder, but ultimately goes beyond a little bit the kind of the disciplinary conventions which you maybe decide to speak to in order to get your funding approved. And I think all funders are aware of this. The higher education policy space, right through to funders, right through to vice chancellors, right through to sort of heads of department. I think everyone kind of knows that we all want to be interdisciplinary, but the structures somehow don't allow us to do it as easily as we might. But it's a problem that we've all kind of somehow failed to crack. And then, of course, you get the international elements, and then it all becomes even more complicated. Understanding your audience, I think, is kind of key. Sometimes you have to speak to certain audiences to enable yourself to then do the work you want to do. Then that's the kind of tactical game, unfortunately, we have to play.
The kind of tactical game that I want to talk to in the last part of this interview, which is that it's quite an exciting role, really, that you have, which is basically you get a lot of freedom to shape it in the way that you want it to. And that requires quite a lot of skills. It's sort of visionary skills, managerial skills, tactical skills, as you just alluded to. So how do you get there?
It's a really interesting question. I've been incredibly lucky in the kind of roles that I've managed to hold over the last sort of decade or so. When I interviewed for my job at the British Library as a digital curator, I always remember thinking that I'm never going to get this job. It's just like quite bizarre that they'd hire me. And then when I was hired, I totally understood why, in the context of that team, that someone with my kind of skill set was required, in that they wanted someone with a bit more of a research background, but lots of other things. I didn't know how to line manage people. I didn't know how to work for a large organization. I didn't know how to think politically about how a large organization has to function in public spaces. Like all this stuff I didn't have, but I kind of learned on the job. And from there, I moved to Sussex in a kind of a research focused role, which did have a kind of a mixed profile in terms of teaching and service and stuff, but it was very research focused. So I got a massive crash course in like applying for funds and not getting funds and getting funds and understand how funding works, whilst also doing some teaching, which kept that kind of part of my existence going. And towards the end of that time, also to take on some leadership roles as well. So I've been kind of really, really lucky in a way that I've ended up with roles that have enabled me to do, if not one thing, to concentrate quite a lot on a particular aspect of what has become my kind of career and my identity during the course of individual roles. And I'm now in a position where a lot of my time is leadership-y rather than the kind of the teaching and research aspects. So I do have at least one project, that kind of research project that keeps me going. What I've realized quite recently actually is the extent to which I have sort of over the last decade grown as someone in sort of UK digital humanities or whatever, and grown a series of skills which sort of didn't really come through design, but have come through, on one hand, sort of the jobs that I had, but on the other hand, a little bit of knowledge that I wanted to bounce between humanities and the cultural sector and leadership stuff. I won't go into too much detail, but I was recently involved in interview processes, a couple of interview processes this term. And they're jobs which people with relatively early career were applying for. That really helped me reflect a bit on the gap between where I was, I think, in my early postdoctoral days and where I am now, and the kind of things that I know that I kind of don't realize that I know, and the kind of things that I think I can try and share with others. It's a tricky one because you end up applying for a role that is, as I am at the moment, which is quite a leadership orientated role. You look at it and think, yeah, I can do that. But actually where all those skills came from is quite complicated to answer. I was talking to someone about this today, actually. There's a glut at the moment of kind of postdocs coming out, which are roughly digital humanities. And there's almost not enough
Really?
people for them at the moment, which is really inspiring. But there's also not really enough places for them to go next. There's not quite enough stepping stones for them to take. And, we know that academia is competitive. And I'm not naive to think that every postdoc's going to find their way into a lectureship. But I feel it's part of my job at the moment to figure out not just what my institution needs, and of course that is the priority, but also what the kind of the sector needs. And, if we've got all these great people moving into postdocs at the moment, we need to know that in 2 or 3 years' time, there are some good jobs for them to be moving into. And I think that feels like a real priority for me at the moment.
I think that's a very good point that you make there. A lot of career development depends on learning on the job, not just on a formal structure. You tick the boxes, you go to a training courses, and then you're formally recognized as so and so. But also the willingness of post holders or people who can provide positions to be willing to take on newcomers. People maybe that don't have quite the experience they might be looking for, but people who they can recognize that they can actually bring enough to the table that they're able to learn on the job. And I think these are the two things that I pick up on this. And also the fact that sometimes a not particularly well-defined area is exactly the space that's required to make this happen.
Yeah, and I think going back to sort of like postdoctoral stuff, I think it always intrigues me the kinds of people that apply for sort of early career or postdoctoral posts in the digital humanities, because they're always so diverse, not just in disciplinary backgrounds, but in the extent to which they have computational skills, or the extent to which that they think from a kind of pure research perspective, or they think from more of a kind of a cultural heritage perspective, for example. And loads of people apply for an early modern history job, and they all have very similar skills. They have an article, they have a book, they're experts in their field, and that kind of stuff. And it's wonderful to kind of work through that process, and for the individuals to pop out of that who are the right people for your department. But then you look at what happens when you post a kind of DHE related job, and you see just this variety of people, and some of whom you look and think, well, I think you're a bit overqualified for that post, but you can't predetermine why someone's applying, and someone else clearly doesn't have necessarily some of the skills for the job, but they're clearly enthusiastic and might be able to learn. And it's a really interesting one, because you end up with these groups of people that sort of come from different places and are hired into these kind of collaborative spaces, who then have to figure out how to work together. When I joined Sussex in 2015 to join the Sussex Humanities Lab when it launched, we were a large group of people all hired into history departments, media studies departments, computer science, sociology. We were a large group of new hires that all came to university at the same time, all called digital humanities lecturers, but sort of hired into a particular department, but kind of cross-listed into this thing called the Humanities Lab. And I think we spent a good year trying to figure out how to work together, frankly. What we gained from that, undoubtedly, was that certainly by the time that I left Sussex, is that it's an incredibly fertile research and teaching environment that's been created there. To some extent, they gave people a bit of a free hit for a good year to kind of just sort of figure it out, which you wouldn't always necessarily get within an institutional context. That kind of investment in giving people the time to kind of play and fail and figure it out really has kind of produced a really productive interdisciplinary space.
I think we're coming to the end now. Well, thank you very much for this exciting interview, James. I wish you all the best in your new role and all the best for the future.
Thank you so much, Peter.